Blood stained the pale marble of the corridor floor, a thin spreading thread that caught the emergency lighting and turned it dark amber. The antiseptic smell Darcy Fennell had spent 2 years training herself to recognize. The one that meant real damage, not the shallow cuts people thought were serious, cut through the cold air and made her breath go short. She pressed both palms flat against Caelan Rhys's chest, trying to keep herself between him and the shattered door at the end of the hall. Her hands were shaking. He was absolutely infuriatingly still. His right hand, the hand 3 surgeons, 2 physiotherapists, and an entire industry of financial journalists had collectively declared finished, closed around her wrist with a steady, unyielding grip and drew her behind him in a single, smooth motion. "I'm still capable, Darcy." His voice was barely above a murmur, but it carried the particular weight of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Stop treating me like I'm already dead." She had not meant to end up here. The stone and glass walls of the Rhys estate rose above the tree line of a private peninsula on Georgian Bay, northern Ontario, looking less like a house than something the land itself had decided to produce. Blunt, enormous, unapologetic. Darcy had been driven through the gates on a grey September morning with 2 suitcases, and the particular kind calm that only comes from having already processed the worst-case scenario. She had done her crying in the bathroom of her father's apartment in Sudbury. By the time she arrived at those gates, she was simply watching. Her father, Douglas Fennell, had made a catastrophic miscalculation of the kind that quiet, anxious men sometimes make when given one opportunity at something larger than themselves. He had been a logistics contractor, middling but competent, until he was brought in to coordinate a supply chain operation for Rhys Group across a stretch of remote northern Alberta. He had told them he had relationships he didn't have. He had promised secure routes that weren't secure. When the operation went sideways and 3 of Caelan's operatives had to be extracted under emergency conditions, the liability attached to Douglas Fennell's failure was totaled at $2.3 million. Douglas had nothing. An apartment, a pension he had already borrowed against, and a daughter who had quit her EMT certification program halfway through when his health deteriorated and the bills needed paying. Darcy had inherited his ability to stay quiet in difficult rooms and her mother's terrifying stubbornness. The combination, she was beginning to understand, was the only reason she had made it to the end of that driveway without falling apart. She was not brought to the Rhys estate as anything dramatic. Caelan Rhys had no use for hostages or theatrics. What he had was a right hand that the best surgeons in Toronto and Montreal had told him would never fully recover. The nerve damage from the Prague operation was too extensive, the fine motor function too compromised, and a physiotherapy schedule that his existing staff could not adequately manage. He needed a skilled clinical aide who would be present, discreet, and available around the clock. Darcy's incomplete EMT training, her 2 years of informal nursing support for her father's chronic illness, and the debt her family owed made her, in the cold arithmetic of Caelan Rhys, exactly useful. She understood what she was. She made herself useful anyway. The estate operated with the quiet discipline of a military installation. There were staff she rarely saw, security personnel she was not introduced to, and a rhythm of meetings and calls that pulsed through the house at all hours. Caelan himself moved through the corridors with the particular contained energy of a man who had spent decades making himself smaller than he actually was, not out of deference, but out of the understanding that the less space you appeared to take up, the more territory you actually held. When she first met him, he was standing at a long window overlooking the bay, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the quiet, complete sentences of someone who never needed to repeat himself. He was broader than she had expected. Not soft broad, but the accumulated breadth of a man who had carried things for a long time and whose body had simply adapted. The right side of his face carried 2 clean scars from the Prague blast, pale against the dark stubble of his jaw. He turned when she entered, and his eyes, a grey so pale they read almost silver in the winter light, assessed her in the brief, unsparing way she imagined he assessed everything. "Fennell," he said, not a question. "Darcy," she replied, because she didn't see why she should be only a surname. Something shifted in those pale eyes, not warmth exactly, more like recalibration. "The brace goes on at 7 in the morning," he said. "Therapy at 8. I'll need you to observe and adjust the hand positioning. The current aid doesn't read the muscle response correctly." He paused. "You'll have the East Suite. There's a protocol document on the desk." That was the entirety of their introduction. Over the weeks that followed, Darcy learned the estate's rhythms the way you learn a body, by paying careful, consistent attention. She learned that Caelan woke before 5, that he spent an hour at his desk before he needed the brace, that he carried himself through every room of that enormous house, as if he owned not just the building but the air inside it. She learned that the physiotherapy sessions were the only time she ever saw him show anything close to frustration. Not at her, and not at the process, but at the distance between where his hand was and where he needed it to be. He would close his eyes for a second, sometimes, jaw tight, and then reset with the same absolute discipline he brought to everything else. She never offered pity. He would have seen it immediately, and she had the feeling that pity was one of the very few things capable of making Caelan Rhys genuinely cold. She did not yet understand that the men who worked under him were watching her, or that one of them was watching for an entirely different reason. Wade Sheridan had been Caelan's second-in-command for 8 years. He was the kind of man who kept his aggression very close to the surface, just beneath the polish of a good suit and an excellent vocabulary, like something waiting for permission to come out. He had dark, watchful eyes and a smile that arrived a half-second too late, as if it had to be consciously produced. Darcy noticed him on a Tuesday afternoon when she was in the library reviewing the updated therapy notes. She heard his voice first, that particular smooth-edged certainty, and then heard Caelan's response, quieter, deliberate in a tone she hadn't heard before. She moved closer to the study door, which was slightly ajar. "The Meridian contract is up for renewal in 6 weeks, Wade was saying. Crosby's been in contact with their board. If we don't go in person, if you don't go in person, Caelan, we lose it, and I can't go in as a substitute anymore. They want to see the principal, and they need to know the principal is functional." Caelan's voice was very quiet. A pause, capable of leading a live operation if required. "I don't run live operations through hand strength, Wade. I run them through intelligence and decision architecture." "I know that." Wade's tone shifted, the polish thinning over something harder. "The market doesn't. You've seen the numbers. 3 clients redirected in 2 months. The board is nervous. The men are nervous. And if I'm honest with you, the way you're managing things right now, staying here, avoiding the public circuit, letting me front every meeting." "What would you suggest?" Caelan asked. It was not an invitation to suggestions. It was a trap, laid quietly, waiting to see if Wade would step into it. Wade stepped into it. "Let me take the Meridian meeting as principal representative, officially. Tell them the operational transition is temporary while you get out." Not loud, not sharp. 2 words delivered with such complete finality that Darcy stopped breathing for a second. She heard Wade's footsteps, unhurried, but the quality of them changed. Something had shifted in him. She pressed herself against the wall as he came through the door, and their eyes met briefly. His gaze moved over her with a cool assessment that had nothing to do with her as a person. After he left, she walked into the study. Caelan was at the window. His right hand was braced, his left hand flat on the glass. "You heard," he said, not an accusation. "Some of it." On the desk beside him, a contract folder had been pushed to the edge, papers starting to slip off. Darcy moved to gather them. His voice, when it came, was very controlled. "Leave them. I have them already." "Darcy," a warning. She straightened up with the papers in her hands and looked at him directly. "I wasn't trying to help you because I think you can't manage it," she said. "I was passing by and they were falling." He looked at her for a long moment. His silver eyes held something that moved just below the surface, complex and unreadable, like water over stone. Then he turned back to the window. "The Meridian annual dinner is Thursday in Toronto," he said. "You'll come with me." She waited. "It's black tie. You'll find something suitable in the guest wardrobe, second floor." She understood without being told that this was not optional. The Meridian Partners' dinner was held in the private ballroom of the King Edward Hotel in downtown Toronto. 200 people from the high-value end of the private security, defense technology, and government consulting world. The kind of room where power was performed very carefully and violence was always very close beneath the surface, speaking in the language of contract values and capacity assessments. Darcy wore a navy silk dress she had found exactly where Caelan said it would be, with a drape at the shoulder that she knew cost more than 3 months of her last pay. She wore it like armor. Caelan wore black, and the combination of the scars and the suit and those pale, still eyes made people step back from him reflexively, as if their bodies recognized something their social training hadn't yet processed. She stayed at his side. That was what she was there for. Vance Crosby found them during the cocktail hour. He was a florid man in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the particular confidence of someone who had been wealthy long enough to confuse it with intelligence. He shook Caelan's hand. Left hand, because everyone in this room knew, with an oleaginous warmth. "Rhys, good to see you out of that estate. We were starting to think the isolation had become permanent." His gaze dropped to the brace visible below Caelan's cuff. "Still working through the recovery, I hear. Nasty business." Caelan smiled. It was the most dangerous thing Darcy had ever seen a human face do. "The recovery is progressing exactly as planned. How are the Meridian conversations going? I noticed you'd been in contact with their board." Crosby's smile held, but something adjusted behind it. Just standard relationship maintenance, no pressure. "Of course." Caelan picked up a glass from a passing tray with his left hand. "How are the Beaumont Group numbers this quarter?" "I heard there were some projection shortfalls." Crosby's jaw tightened slightly. He shifted his attention to Darcy, performing a deliberate change of subject. "And who is this?" "Darcy Fennell," she said before Caelan could introduce her. Crosby's eyes moved over her in the way certain men's eyes move. Appraising, reductive. "The caretaker, I imagine. Important to have good support staff when you're—" He gestured vaguely at Caelan's hand. She heard something change in Caelan's breathing. Slight, controlled, but she heard it. Before she had consciously decided to speak, she did. "Mr. Crosby," she said, and she used the tone she had once heard a senior RA physician use to reduce an entire room to silence. "The last time I checked, Rhys Group's operational success rate over the past decade was 43% higher than the sector average. That's not a staffing metric. That's a decision-making metric." She tilted her head slightly. "A man's usefulness is in the quality of his judgment, not the dexterity of his grip. Perhaps if you spent less time calculating when to move on Rhys Group's clients and more time shoring up your own methodology, your Q3 numbers wouldn't require quite so much creative interpretation." The silence around their small cluster was immediate and absolute. Crosby's face moved through several colors. Wade, standing 10 feet away with a glass of scotch, had gone very still. Caelan looked at her. It was the first time she had seen genuine surprise on his face, unguarded, open for just a second before the control returned. Something else was there too, underneath it, something that felt to her like recognition. "You'll have to forgive Darcy," he said to Crosby, his voice carrying a tone she had never heard from him before, something almost warm, almost amused. "She has very little patience for assumptions." Crosby made his excuses and retreated. Wade's eyes followed Darcy across the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. 20 minutes later, the lights went out. It was not subtle, and it was not accidental. The ballroom dropped into total darkness, and the screaming started before Darcy's eyes had adjusted to nothing. She heard the crack of something heavy against glass, a window, somewhere, and then voices in the dark, disciplined and purposeful, which was more frightening than the noise itself. Caelan's left hand found her arm in the blackness. "Stay low with me." She crouched and moved because his grip told her where to go. Around them, 200 guests in formal attire dissolved into chaos, chairs overturned, glasses shattering, someone screaming near the far wall. In the intermittent flash of phone lights and the emergency strip lighting near the floor, Darcy saw two men in dark clothing moving through the room with a focused, unhurried efficiency that terrified her more than anything else. "Brogan," Caelan said quietly into the darkness beside her. A voice answered from her left. "Got you. 3 in the east corridor, 2 on the mezzanine. Wade's gone." Darcy felt those words land like a stone dropping through still water. "Wade's gone." "I know," Caelan said. He sounded entirely unsurprised. "We need to move," Brogan said. "Service corridor now." They moved. Brogan, a broad, completely unruffled man who Darcy had only ever seen carrying Caelan's files before, and who she now understood had been carrying something else entirely this whole time, led them through a door she hadn't noticed in the back wall. The kitchen erupted around them. Staff scattered, trays dropped. Someone made the mistake of blocking the corridor ahead of Caelan. He stepped past them with an efficiency of movement that required no hands at all. A stairwell, a locked door, Brogan's keycard, then cool air and the underground parking structure and 2 black vehicles running. Darcy climbed into the back of the first car. Caelan got in beside her. The door slammed. The car moved before she had taken a proper breath. In the darkness of the back seat, she turned to him and her hands went to his chest, to his arm. The way hands do when adrenaline is still running and logic hasn't fully restocked. "Are you hit? Your hand? You wouldn't feel it properly if the nerve damage." "Darcy." "Let me check. The right side especially. If something grazed it, you might not." "Darcy." His left hand came up and closed around both of hers, stilling them. The grip was firm, not urgent. "Look at me." She looked at him. In the passing streetlights, his face was absolutely composed. Not the composure of someone holding something down, but the composure of someone in their natural element. "I'm not hit," he said. "I'm not damaged, and I don't need you standing in front of armed men holding a cocktail fork." She had been holding a cocktail fork. She didn't know when she had picked it up. "I was trying to." "I know what you were trying to do." His grip on her hands didn't loosen. His silver eyes held hers in the low, strobing light, and the expression in them was the most complicated thing she had ever seen on a human face. Precision and something rawer living in the same space, neither one cancelling out the other. "I'm still capable, Darcy. Do you understand? My hand is the only thing that doesn't work the way it used to. Everything else is exactly what it was." She stared at him. "I need you to know that," he said, "because what happens next is going to require you to trust me completely, and I need you to trust me as what I am, not as what everyone has decided I've become." She felt something shift in her chest. The last of whatever armor she had constructed in the bathroom of her father's apartment in Sudbury, maintained through every careful, professional week in that enormous house. She felt it come down not with a crash, but with a slow, complete release, like a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Wade sold you out," she said. "Yes." To Crosby. To Crosby, and to the people Crosby owes favors to, who are more serious than Crosby himself. His voice remained completely level. "Wade has been building a case for 6 months that I'm no longer operationally viable. He needed tonight to be the proof." A pause. "He didn't count on you putting Crosby off balance during cocktail hour. That disrupted his timeline." She absorbed this. "What happens now?" she asked. Caelan looked out the window at the Toronto skyline moving past them in the rain. When he turned back, his expression had settled into something that wasn't anger. It was colder and more purposeful than anger, the way a compass isn't emotional about pointing north. "Now," he said, "I remind Wade Sheridan exactly who he betrayed." They did not go to the estate. Brogan drove them to a facility on the edge of Mississauga that looked, from the outside, like a data center, and was, on the inside, the operational core of everything Rhys Group actually was. Darcy sat in the corner of a room full of monitors and men who moved with the specific efficiency of people who had planned for exactly this contingency, and she waited to be told to leave. Caelan didn't tell her to leave. She stayed. She made herself useful: coffee, space management, staying clear of what she didn't understand, and watching what she did understand, which was Caelan Rhys conducting a simultaneous, multi-threaded dismantling of Wade Sheridan's position, with the braced hand resting on the table, and the left hand moving across a keyboard with a speed that was almost offensive. "Pull the Beaumont counterintelligence file," he said at one point. "Crosby's entire leverage play depends on the Beaumont relationship. If we show their board what Crosby knew about the Reykjavik data exposure and sat on for 3/4, they'll pull him out of those conversations before Monday." "That's a 5-year relationship," Brogan said. "It's a relationship Crosby built on concealed liability. That's not a relationship. That's a delayed crisis." Caelan didn't look up from the screen. "Do it." She watched the men in that room recalibrate, over the course of those hours, toward Caelan Rhys with a completeness that was almost physical. She understood, watching it happen, that this was not new, that the recalibration was simply returning to its original position, and that the past 6 months had been an externally imposed deviation that no one in this room had actually believed in. On the second night, a man was brought in who had been running logistics for Wade's operation. He sat across the table from Caelan and said, with the particular fatalism of someone who had already run the numbers, "He's at the Ashbridge facility. He's got 12 people with him and Crosby's private security team as backup. He thinks you can't come to him." Caelan said nothing for a moment. "Why does he think that?" he asked. The man's eyes moved to the brace on his right hand. Caelan smiled. It was the same smile he had deployed at Crosby over champagne. "He's still looking at the hand," he said to no one in particular. Brogan said, "We can go in with a full team. You'll take 1 vehicle to the facility perimeter. I'll go in from the east access." He stood up. "Wade built his entire case on the assumption that I am diminished. He needs to understand what it cost him." Darcy stepped in front of him. She knew as she was doing it that it was not going to work. But some things the body does regardless of what the brain calculates. "Caelan," she kept her voice even, "he has 12 people and Crosby's contractors." "I'm aware." "You," she stopped, because she had been about to say you only have one good hand, and she realized, standing there with those silver eyes looking back at her with absolute patience, that she was doing the exact thing she had quietly condemned everyone else for doing. She was looking at the brace, not at him. She stepped aside. He reached out with his left hand and touched her jaw, a single, deliberate point of contact, like a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. "When I come back," he said, "we're going to have a very different conversation than the one we've been having for 2 months." Then he was gone. The Ashbridge facility was a decommissioned logistics hub near the lakeshore, all concrete and corrugated steel, and the particular bleak openness of industrial waterfront at 3 in the morning. Wade Sheridan paced the main floor with the agitation of a man who had made a large bet and was beginning to question the odds. He had 12 people. He had Crosby's backup. He had planned for an assault, numbers, containment, the controlled chaos of a man cornered and outnumbered. What he got was 1 door opening. Caelan Rhys walked in alone, still in the black dinner jacket from the King Edward, the brace catching the overhead lights as he moved. He walked to the center of the floor and stopped. He didn't look at Wade's 12 people. He looked at Wade. "I want to understand," he said. "Not for the reason you'd assume. I want to understand how long you've been building this." Wade's jaw was tight. 2 years. Since Prague. Since it became clear that you were no longer— "Go ahead," Caelan said. "That you were no longer what this company needed." "And what does this company need, Wade?" "Someone who can operate in the field. Someone whose clients aren't whispering about them behind closed doors. Someone who doesn't require daily medical management just to function. You mean someone who performs, Caelan said quietly. You mean someone who performs the version of strength that makes you comfortable. He tilted his head. You've been watching my hand for 2 years. You forgot to watch everything else. Shoot him, Wade said. Nobody moved. Wade turned. The 12 people, the contractors, the entire structure he had built, none of it moved. Brogan stepped forward from the shadows near the east wall, and behind him, 2 more men from the Mississauga facility. They had been in position for 40 minutes. Wade's face moved through the complete sequence, certainty, confusion, realization, terror, in the space of about 4 seconds. They were never yours, Caelan said. You spent 2 years auditing my capability, and you never once audited your own loyalty figures. That's the difference between us, Wade. That's always been the difference. He drew from his jacket, left-handed, and raised his arm. His aim was impeccable. Caelan, Wade's voice broke. The hand you can't possibly. I'm ambidextrous, Caelan said. I have been since I was 8 years old. Did you know that? A pause. 8 years old and you never knew. He fired once. The shot was precise, catching Wade in the shoulder, because Caelan Rhys did not execute former employees in cold blood, and because the point was never the consequence, it was the precision. And Wade went down against the concrete wall, clutching his arm, his bravado shattering into something small and bewildered. Get him out, Caelan said to Brogan, and contact Meridian's legal team. We have material to share. He walked back out into the lakefront night, and the men behind him did not look at his hand. They simply followed, without hesitation, the way water follows a gradient, because there was no other direction that made sense. The car pulled back into the Mississauga facility 2 hours before dawn. Darcy had not slept. She was standing at the entrance when the vehicle came to a stop, and she was moving before the door had fully opened. She crossed the distance between them in a way that bypassed every careful professional boundary she had constructed over 2 months of brace fittings and therapy notes and deliberate, sensible neutrality. She grabbed the lapels of his jacket with both hands, and he caught her, his left arm coming around her with the immediate certainty of someone who had thought about exactly this. And she felt the solidness of him and the fact that he was whole and alive and entirely, stubbornly himself. You scared me, she said into the wool of his jacket. I know. His chin came to rest against the top of her head. That wasn't the intention. Yes, it was. A pause. She felt him breathe, slow, deliberate, like a man who had been holding something carefully for a very long time and was finally allowing himself to set it down. Partially, he admitted. She pulled back enough to look at him. The scars caught the harsh light of the facility exterior. His silver eyes were tired and completely clear, the way eyes get when everything that was being held at a controlled distance has finally been dealt with. You're ambidextrous, she said. Since I was 8. And you let everyone, Crosby, Wade, the whole industry, believe for 6 months that you couldn't. That I was finished, he said. Yes. He didn't look apologetic. Wade built his entire operation on a false premise. I needed him to commit to it completely before I removed it. You can't expose a structure by arguing about it. You have to wait for it to be built and then take the foundation out. She stared at him. That's the coldest thing I've ever heard, she said. Probably. It worked. It always works. He reached up with his left hand and pushed a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture that was nothing like the careful, medically appropriate proximity she had maintained for 2 months, and everything like the conversation he had promised they would have. The question is whether you can work alongside a man who thinks like that. She thought about the marble floors and the therapy notes and the cocktail fork. She thought about standing in front of him in that dark corridor, shaking, certain she was the one who needed to protect him, and what it had cost her to realize she had it completely backwards. She thought about the feeling she'd had in the back of that car, moving through the Toronto rain, when she had stopped being his aide and started being something else she didn't have a clinical term for. "I'm already working alongside him," she said. "I'd like to negotiate the terms." The smile, when it arrived, was not the cold, dangerous thing she had seen him deploy in ballrooms. It was something private and completely unperformed, and it made him look, for just a moment, like a man who had been carrying the weight of a long, deliberate campaign and had finally been given permission to put it down. He pulled her in, and when he kissed her, it tasted like dark coffee and resolution, and the particular relief of a plan that had worked, messier than he had drawn it, and somehow exactly right. The Rhys Group board met the following Monday. What they found was a second-in-command facing criminal charges, a competitor whose largest client relationship had just dissolved over a suppressor liability disclosure, and Caelan Rhys, seated at the head of the table, with the brace-off for the first time in 6 months, making it clear, in the quiet and absolute way that he made everything clear, that the question of his capacity would not be revisited. The market had decided he was broken, he had let them, and then, with the patience of a man who understood that the most effective operations are the ones no one realizes have begun, he had taken everything back. Darcy sat 2 seats to his left, having declined the role of medical aide as of that morning, and accepted in its place a conversation about what she actually wanted, which turned out to be exactly the same territory, mapped under very different terms. The industry spent the following weeks recalibrating. Whispers reversed direction. Contracts that had quietly rerouted themselves over 6 months began with equal quiet to find their way home. And in the mornings, in the room with the Georgian Bay windows and the pale northern light coming in off the water, Darcy still managed the therapy sessions. Not because he couldn't do without her, but because he didn't want to. Which was, as it turned out, the only arrangement either of them had ever wanted to have.